Number 10. The Fort of Lage. The Lage Fort is situated in Guanabara Bay near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Its history goes back to 1555 when the Frenchman Nicolas Villegagnon thought he would start engaging in an armed conflict against the people who controlled Brazil at the time. That's right, he tried to take possession of the island to shoot cannons at the Portuguese. It didn't work, and 30 years later, the government of Rio de Janeiro suggested a huge fortress to be built on the island. Of course, with the way things work, it didn't happen until 1644. But even after the huge fortress was completed, it wasn't of much use. In 1711, it offered no help when the French attacked. The fort was improved in 1715, but still never really came in handy. That is, until it was used in 1836 as a prison. It continued to hold various prisoners and to be used in several military uprisings until eventually it was damaged by bombs in 1893. Then in 1903, it was updated and powerful cannons were installed, along with electricity. But through the years, the fort proved of little use each and every time until it was mostly abandoned. Today, the fort is a decaying pile of concrete on the water and nobody's really sure what to do with it, with locals unsure what it was ever used for in the first place. It looks like an awesome place to do some dangerous urban exploring, if you're into that kind of adventure and you're just the right type of fearless. Number 9. Floating McDonald's Barge. The floating McDonald's barge is one of the weirdest failed experiments in restaurant history, as if anyone ever thought to themselves, I would really love some McDonald's when slowly getting seasick. I mean, really, who would want the risk of throwing up their McNuggets and fries? Would you risk it? I wouldn't. The barge was presented in Vancouver in 1986 for the World Expo of Transportation and Communication. It was like any other McDonald's at the time, except it floated. The barge was used heavily in 1986, but after all the foreigners left, the locals weren't that interested in burgers on the water. It fell into disuse, was abandoned, and in the past 30 years has been used as nothing except for one of the film locations for the movie Blade Trinity. The fate of the McDonald's barge is unknown and shrouded in mystery. There have been attempts through the years to refurbish the barge and make it back into a restaurant, but it's never happened. It was anchored in the Burrard Inlet for 30 years before being towed to Maple Ridge, where it is still floating and decaying with barely any hope of ever being used again. Number 8. Battleship Island. The ruins of Battleship Island are about as spooky and as mysterious as it gets. The proper name for the island is Hashima Island, located in Japan's Nagasaki Prefecture. It looks like the site of an apocalyptic civilization where all the humans have been eradicated, but in truth, the island began as an undersea mining operation purchased by the Mitsubishi Corporation in 1890. The island was uninhabited at the time, but was swiftly transformed by building homes, shops, schools, and everything else needed for a modern society. But the time the 1950s rolled around, the population was up to 5,000, and the island was a self-sustained city of miners. But why does it look like some type of devastating plague or curse fell on Battleship Island? Where did the people go? It's because coal prices plummeted and the island became redundant. By 1975, there was no reason for anyone to live on the island. Everybody was evacuated. But here's what a lot of people don't know. Before and during World War II, the Japanese shipped prisoners of war to Battleship Island and forced them to work as slaves in the mines, something that resulted in what historians estimate could be thousands of unrecorded deaths. Being a prisoner of war is one of those things you might be fascinated by when you read about it, but no one in their right mind would ever want to be one. Number 7. The Floating Palace. There is a mysterious floating palace in India that has been haunting the middle of a lake for hundreds of years. The palace is located in Mansagar Lake in Jaipur. It looks like something out of Arabian Nights, with its beautiful yellow facade and trees literally growing out of its roof. But the history behind the water palace, named the Taj Mahal, is a little strange. The problem is that nobody really knows for sure who built it or when. Would you live in a palace with a mysterious past like that? I sure wouldn't. As far as historical records show, the Taj Mahal was constructed 300 years ago for the main purpose of giving the ruling Maharaja a place to relax, have picnics, and hunt ducks. In other words, it was a rich ruler's private retreat. So private that it was built partially submerged underneath the lake. So, why was the floating palace abandoned and left to rot for 200 years? Nobody is really sure. The palace doesn't actually have a single chamber. Instead, it boasts only a courtyard with a garden on its top. It was probably seen as useless, so the locals just ignored it, allowing sewage from the lake to slowly seep through the cracks in the stone. Eventually, the dirty water basically rotted away the construction materials, and now there is almost no reason to visit the palace other than a morbid curiosity about its past. Number 6. Abandoned Chateau. There's an abandoned chateau in France near Les Trois Moutiers that is almost inaccessible, seeming to float in the middle of its very own lake. The chateau is in a rapid state of decay, and yet amazingly, it was just purchased by a group of 11,000 strangers who pooled their money together through a French crowdfunding service, essentially adopting the castle. It's called Chateau de la Montchonnière, and it was built probably in the 13th century. The amazing structures was owned by the Attorney General of France until the 1770s, when the French Revolution caused the castle to be abandoned. There was a plan to reconstruct the ruin in the 1800s, but it never happened. Then, even though the castle is floating on the water, it suffered a devastating fire in 1932, even after being purchased in 1981 by a wealthy man who wanted to save it. The castle just didn't seem to want to be saved. But now, the group of strangers has paid over $500,000 collectively for the chateau. It's not sure how they're going to split up the castle, but the plan is to bring it back to its former glory, and hopefully even clean out the dirty moat it's sitting in. Would you crowdfund a castle like that? Tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. Then remember to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about cool abandoned stuff. Number 5. Monroe Seaforts. The Monroe Seaforts are just plain weird. These creepy relics from World War II are steeped in mystery. They're located off the coast of England, used during the war as naval fortifications. Their primary objective was to stop enemies from landing on the coast and to prevent enemy bombardments by firing at the German aircraft with artillery. The forts were considered a terrible idea in the beginning because they cost so much money, but they soon proved their worth. With their massive guns and 40mm cannons, the forts helped to prevent air raid squadrons from passing the Thames estuary and attacking Liverpool, a critical port needed to secure goods from the United States. The fort couldn't stop all the attacks, but they certainly did their part. After the war, the forts were no longer needed. They fell into disrepair and one by one crumbled into the sea. One of the forts was taken over by pirate radio in the 1960s, and an artist even tried to live in one back in 2005. But now, after decades guarding the coast, the creepy forts have nearly totally been destroyed. Number 4. Lost Russian Dam. There is a very spooky abandoned dam in Russia, sitting half-finished waiting to be completed or destroyed. Construction on the Kropovinsky Dam began in 1975. It was to be erected in the Kemerovo region, but it ran into trouble and never managed to recover. The 1980s saw a huge string of protests against the dam, with every day people trying to defend the environment by preventing its construction. The project was suspended temporarily in light of the movement, but then the workers never came back. They actually left the dam not even half finished, with steel girders and concrete columns still standing in the middle of the remote Russian lake even today. There are plans in place to renovate and rebuild the dam, but to be honest, it's not optimistic that the dam will ever be finished. For now, it's just an ugly and mysterious eyesore in the middle of an otherwise beautiful landscape, with unused construction equipment slowly rotting and ruining the view. Number 3. The Floating Hospital. Today, the Floating Hospital is a non-profit organization that gives healthcare services to less fortunate people in New York City. It's a land-based operation, but back in the 1800s, it was literally a floating hospital. The organization began on the Emma Abbott in 1876, which floated through the New York harbor and welcomed on board poor children to get free medical service. The hospital was staffed by pediatricians, nurses, dentists, and even social workers. And the best part, other than being a young child and getting to go on a boat, was that the healthcare was completely free. This was way ahead of its time, and even freer than the healthcare is today. In the 20th century, the floating hospital served roughly 5 million children. Part of the treatment was simply to be on a boat and breathe clean air, as New York was considered to be one of the most polluted and toxic places anywhere in America. However, the floating hospital was eventually abandoned. The Emma Abbott vanished, and nobody seemed to know where it went. And the last vessel, the Lila Atchison Wallace, was retired in 2003. Number 2. The Floating Hotel. The floating hotel opened in 1988 off the coast of Australia, promising to be a paradise resort floating on the Great Barrier Reef. It was a megastructure, 7 stories tall with 200 rooms, a helicopter landing pad, a tennis court, and an underwater observatory. However, things didn't turn out well for the floating hotel. Over the next 10 years, it floated thousands of miles across the ocean and came to rest in the waters of North Korea. It's abandoned, decaying, and no longer of any use to anyone. But how did this happen? The public opening of the floating hotel was delayed by a tropical cyclone. Some of the amenities were damaged. The underwater observatory sank, and the transfer shuttle, used for getting passengers to the actual hotel, was destroyed. It was then discovered that over 100,000 discarded pieces of ammunition, artillery rounds, and explosives from World War II were resting directly beneath the barge. It was a complete failure. The hotel closed within the same year it opened. From there, the hotel was floated to Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. It was a huge success and became a wildly popular entertainment venue for over 10 years, until the owners ran into financial trouble. The hotel was then floated to North Korea in 1997, where it stays to this day. It ran into some trouble in 2008 when a North Korean soldier shot a visiting tourist from South Korea inside the vessel. Since then, the floating hotel has been eerily silent. And number 1, Abandoned Dragon Park. There is a creepy abandoned water park in Hue, Vietnam, floating on the water after being closed down just 2 years after it opened. Today, the giant dragon statue in the center of the park, rearing its ferocious head out of the water, is a monument to a failed dream. The park isn't on a single map, and is not the easiest place to find. It's somewhere near the ancient city of Hue. We know it was built for around $30 million, opening in 2004. When it opened, nobody wanted to visit it. It may have been cool to look at with its dragons and silly attractions, but the locals didn't have much interest in a corny theme park, and there wasn't enough time to make the park popular for foreigners. By 2006, the park ran out of money and closed. Today, the only people who come to the floating dragon park to see the statues covered in graffiti are foreign backpackers looking for Instagram pictures. The locals believe the whole place is cursed and won't dare step foot on it. Plus, the water in which the park was built is said to be full of crocodiles, making it a rather perilous journey. You'd need an experienced crew of explorers, along with a few weapons for protection, to even think about entering this place.
Number 10. The Bigfoot of Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, soldiers saw a lot of terrifying things, some of them proven to be real, and some of them living at the edge of legend and fact. One of those bizarre nightmare monsters is a mysterious Bigfoot-like monster that lived in the jungle. It's known as Battleship, a creepy beast that skulks the forests of Vietnam and Laos and is rarely seen by humans. The Battleship stands about 6 feet, 2 meters tall. It's hairy and looks like an ape, and it's apparently highly aggressive. The first sightings of the Battleship came from the early 1900s. But then during the Vietnam War, because there was so much guerrilla warfare going on in the jungle, soldiers continuously found themselves bumping into what they thought was the Battleship. The most legendary encounter came in the early days of the war. A group of men from the 101st Airborne Division were taking a break in a mountainous region of the jungle when they felt something stalking them. At first, they believed it to be an ambush of the North Vietnamese soldiers. Instead, they witnessed a monster with red hair, dark eyes, and a gaping mouth. It looked at the soldiers, who thought it could have been an orangutan, and then vanished back into the jungle, making a ruckus as it went. The soldiers were shocked, not knowing if they'd witnessed a rare jungle primate or the legendary Battleship. It seems likely that it was just a bizarre gorilla-like creature, but perhaps there was some truth to the legend of the Battleship. We may never know for sure. Number 9. The Giant of Kandahar. As far as anyone knows, the Giant of Kandahar is classified by the US government. At least its existence is classified, along with a deadly encounter that the giant had with a group of United States soldiers operating in Afghanistan. This is what allegedly happened. In 2002, a squadron of soldiers went missing deep in the desert. A special ops task force was sent to find them. The task force eventually located a large cave in the middle of nowhere, with military equipment scattered about inside. As the team entered the cave, they were confronted by a humanoid giant 15 feet, 5 meters tall. It impaled one of the soldiers on a giant spear and then turned on the rest of the squadron. Luckily, these were special ops soldiers and weren't scared of a big burly monster. They eventually took the thing down, though it took them concentrating their M4 machine guns on it for nearly 30 seconds. That's a whole lot of firepower. With the giant dead, the soldiers airlifted it back to the base using a helicopter. Nobody knew where the giant came from or how it had been living alone inside a cave in the middle of nowhere. To this day, there's no official record of the giant or the incident. You can try to find out information about the beast, but the records are incomplete and spotty. It may just be another one of those stories that we'll find out about when the government decides to declassify the information they do have. Number 8. The Atomic Flatwoods Monster. In 1952, an atomic monster descended on Flatwoods, West Virginia. It was seen once and only once by a group of eyewitnesses. According to History.com, it all happened when a pair of brothers were playing outside and witnessed a red light fall from the sky and crash onto a nearby farm. The youngsters, along with their mother, rushed to see what the light was. So did a few other people from the area. In total, 7 residents witnessed a monster that looked like Frankenstein's creation appear out of the trees. It had a green face, its body was blood red, and it was glowing as if nuclear. It was such a frightening story that it picked up traction all across the country. Sure, most of the witnesses were kids, but there were adults there too, making it a credible story. People in the town were terrified because it was 1952 and the Cold War was in full swing. With the advancement of nuclear bombs, people were terrified that what was witnessed in Flatwoods was an atomic monster. However, the thing was never seen again, and to this day, no explanation has ever been given for what the creature may have been. Number 7. Chased by ghosts. In the 1970s, U.S. Army soldiers destroyed a series of tunnels in Germany to try and get rid of a ghost. That's right, there was a ghost allegedly haunting the people who lived by their base in the small town of Freihung, where there's been a major army installation since 1945. In the center of the town, there used to be an old castle where a noblewoman died many years ago. The castle was demolished and a hotel was built in its place. It was the hotel which the ghost haunted, and specifically the tunnels beneath the hotel. Locals call her the White Lady. In the 70s, this ghost wandered the streets at night, scaring drivers in their cars, and she was seen frequently meandering through the tunnels underneath a local hotel. In an attempt to rid themselves of the ghost, the town turned to the American troops and asked them to demolish the tunnels, which they did. However, the ghost refused to leave. Even after the tunnels were destroyed, the White Lady was still witnessed floating through the hotel at night and sometimes appearing in the dark streets outside. Perhaps if you visit today, you can still see her if you're very lucky. Number 6. Japanese soldiers and the Mermaid. During World War II, Japanese soldiers were occupying the K Islands in Indonesia. This was back in 1943, and these islands were fairly remote, which made for the perfect conditions for spotting something extraordinary. The islands are pretty small, covering an area of only about 500 square miles. Today, these islands are famous for their beautiful beaches. However, in 1943, they were the location of one of the most bizarre mermaid sightings in history. The Japanese soldiers were part of a surveillance team on a remote island. They began witnessing strange creatures in the water near their base. The monsters were unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen before. They had limbs like ordinary people, except their faces were twisted and ugly. They had fish mouths filled with sharp needle-like teeth. They also had skin that was pink like salmon, with spines protruding from their necks and shoulders and heads. Of course, these didn't look like traditional mermaids. They were more like disgusting frog people. The Japanese continued to see them playing in the lagoon, swimming at the beach, and hanging around near the water. Despite their efforts, they were never able to catch one. When they asked the local islanders what the creatures were, they called them orangutan, which translates roughly to human fish. Perhaps these creatures simply died out, or perhaps they never existed. Investigators will have to continue to hunt down any evidence of their existence until they find something concrete. Number 5. UFO Sickness. In 1951, a regiment of soldiers fighting in the Korean War were stationed near the city of Chorwon, about 60 miles from the capital of Seoul. They were preparing to bomb a village with artillery when out of nowhere they witnessed strange lights coming from far up in the hills. It looked like the lights were drifting across the mountain. What happened next would become a mystery for the ages. The lights were only witnessed for a handful of minutes. The lights pulsed and glowed as they drifted over the hills. The soldiers fired their weapons at the floating lights, but nothing happened. Then, they were attacked by ray beams, like searchlights sweeping over the entire platoon. Afterward, the lights were gone and the men had no idea what happened. However, 3 days later, the entire company of soldiers needed to be evacuated to a hospital for medical treatment because they were sick as dogs. They had the symptoms of radiation sickness and were horribly ill. The soldiers did eventually recover, but it was a long and tough road. It was as if they'd been blasted with a high-energy radiation beam. Many believe it was a freak UFO sighting and that the alien ships radiated them. This also happens to be one of the biggest UFO sightings in history because there were at least 42 men who witnessed the event, each with the exact same story. What do you think? 42 people with the same story and the same illness? It's too straightforward to be a total hoax. We may never know unless the government declassifies something incredible or the aliens return. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Then remember to subscribe to American Eye if you haven't already. More videos just like this are coming out very soon. Number 4. The Hounds of World War I. During the Battle of Mons in World War I, with the British troops facing off against German soldiers in August of 1914, something strange happened. The British soldiers sustained heavy casualties because of the fighting, but they managed to push the Germans back. But the Germans weren't the only thing the British Army had to fear. When a group of men went to patrol no man's land, the vast and barren area between the two sides of the fighting, they vanished. When their bodies were recovered several days later, teeth marks were discovered on their throats as if they'd been ripped apart by a massive wolf. Then during the night, the soldiers began hearing howling coming from the darkness. From then on, almost every soldier that went into no man's land at night vanished and were found with their throats ripped out. Some soldiers witnessed a huge gray beast like a werewolf wandering not far from the trenches, though nobody actually saw the creature, and eventually it kinda just disappeared. Nobody exactly knows what the Hound of Mons was. It could have been an extremely hungry wolf, a vicious wolf pack, or, according to Canadian veteran F.J. Newhouse, a hound from hell created by the German scientist Dr. Gottlieb Hochmüller after switching a wolf's brain with the mind of a madman and setting it loose on British soldiers. Do you think that's even possible? I don't, but then again, who knows for sure. Number 3. Giant Sea Monster. In 1973, U.S. soldiers in Laos killed and captured a very real monster. It wasn't a mythical mermaid or a hound from hell, it was a mythical serpent known to the locals as the Queen of the Naga. The slippery beast was pulled out of the Mekong River and measured at over 24 feet, 7 meters long. It took over 24 men to hold the fish up, angering the locals because they killed their sacred river monster. However, this story seems more likely to be a bit of a fabrication. It's based on the photograph of a group of servicemen who discovered an oarfish stranded on the beach in 1996 near their base in San Diego. The picture is real, the oarfish is real, and it really is a giant mythical sea serpent. But the picture of the soldiers holding it up has been miscaptioned all over the internet. Still, the oarfish is nothing short of legendary. In many Asian countries, they believe an oarfish being found on the shore is an omen of something terrible and destructive to come. Number 2. Yeti Footprints. Members of the army in India recently claimed that they found footprints of the Yeti monster. In a rather unusual move, the army tweeted to roughly 6 million followers that it had identified the very real footprints of the mythical Yeti monster. The post was accompanied with pictures of the prints found near the Makalu base camp high up in the Himalayas. As you can probably imagine, the public ridiculed the army mercilessly. The Yeti is an abominable snowman said to live in the Himalayas and Siberia, though there hasn't been much more concrete evidence of its existence. Actually, nothing scientific proves its existence at all. Online, people mocked the army, asking them if maybe it was one of the giants from Game of Thrones instead of the Yeti, obviously ridiculing them. Nobody knows what the prints were or if they were even animal prints at all. They could have just been indents in the snow. But without further evidence, the social media post was pure speculation. Number 1. Zombie Attack. There appears to be a clip floating around on the internet nowadays that shows what is unmistakably a zombie attacking a soldier. The footage was taken using a night vision camera from a police helicopter, which apparently witnessed a man being chased and then ripped apart. The helicopter was monitoring a soldier who was running for his life from a group of rabid zombies. Once the zombies caught up to him, they shoved him to the ground and ripped him limb from limb. Do we know if it's real? No, we don't. It could be a well-edited fraud, or it could be something that should have everyone on the planet fearing for their lives. It's unclear when exactly this footage was taken or if it's legitimate, but the implication that Russia had a close call with a zombie plague is quite frankly terrifying. Number 10. Aum Shinrikyo. In Tokyo, Japan on March 20th, 1995, one of the worst cult attacks in the country occurred. 5 bags filled with toxic liquid nerve agents were left on board 5 trains in one of the biggest cities in the world on the busiest underground systems in existence. And the bags were leaking. Nobody knew what was happening at first. Passengers on board the trains felt their eyes stinging. Then in seconds, those on board the trains were choking and vomiting. Some were left blinded, and some fell to the floor paralyzed. It was absolutely terrifying. When the dust settled and the trains were stopped and everybody got off, 13 people were dead and 5,800 were seriously injured. The attacks were coordinated on 3 separate train lines. What exactly was used to injure these perfectly innocent people that were simply going to work in the morning? It was something called sarin, a devastating nerve agent first developed over 40 years earlier by the Nazis. All these years later, the 1995 Tokyo attack is still the worst domestic terrorist attack to ever happen on Japanese soil. Now for the cult. The people responsible went by the name Aum Shinrikyo, a French religious group who believed the world was about to end and decided they would take some people out a bit early. They kidnapped, they injured, they killed, and they used chemical and biological weapons to attack wherever they possibly could. Their leader, Shoko Asahara, was captured and put to death. Many other members of the cult were also executed by Japanese authorities, and by the 2000s the cult had gone underground. Number 9. Rajneeshpuram. Rajneeshpuram was one of the craziest cults that ever impacted the United States of America. This fringe cult rose and collapsed in the 1980s in Central Oregon. The cult was based around a man named Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He created a religious community supposedly centered around free love and meant to be a utopia. Believe it or not, the cult was pretty far ahead of the curve when it came to things like organic farming and recycling. At first, everything was fine. Thousands of people joined the cult and millions of dollars were raised by the followers. They even had their very own commune where people lived in what they believed was a utopia. But by 1983, things started to go really off the rails, and in 1984, the cult was responsible for the largest bioterrorist attack that ever happened on U.S. soil. Cult members coordinated an attack to infect salad bars. That's right, ordinary salad bars in 10 restaurants throughout Wasco County. They infected the salad bars with salmonella in a bizarre attempt to incapacitate the voters in the city so that their own people could win the local elections. Nobody died from the poisoning, though at least 751 people were infected. A string of other crimes would ultimately bring the cult to its knees. There was immigration fraud, voting fraud, attempted murder, arson, and drug smuggling. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was forced to leave the U.S. because of charges put against him, and his followers quickly abandoned the cult. The ranch they lived on was sold at auction in 1988 for $4.5 million. Number 8. Heaven's Gate. The cult of Heaven's Gate in the United States was the first of the modern era to use the internet to share their bizarre beliefs and to also make money from them. The cult was originally formed in the 1970s, but didn't really hit its stride for another 20 years. It was founded by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who renamed themselves Bo and Peep. But just what did this weird cult believe in? Well, Applewhite told his followers that he was in fact the second coming of Jesus Christ and that God was an alien. The followers also believed they were living in the end of times and that they would probably have to battle demons before all was said and done. The cult didn't really do much except try to recruit more members and run around the country lecturing people about how UFOs were about to make contact with humans. They just drove around, recruited, and brainwashed people. The grand finale came in 1997. 39 members, including Applewhite, dressed themselves in tracksuits and sneakers and slurped up applesauce laced with vodka and poison. They then laid down, put bags over their heads, and died. The hope was that they would ascend to a spacecraft as it passed over Earth. Instead, aliens never showed up, the world didn't end, and they were buried in the ground. Number 7. Aetheria Society. The Aetheria Society started in the 1950s when an English taxi driver by the name of George King allegedly received a directive from outer space. Apparently, the dispatch from space convinced him to start this weird cult. It's a religious group whose main purpose is to communicate with aliens to better human society. The craziest part is that they're actually still around today. The Aetheria Society isn't dangerous, they don't practice hate, and they don't drink the Kool-Aid. Instead, they're a legitimately established religion. It's just that they believe in aliens and space people. Nobody knows exactly how many people are part of the Aetheria Society, but we do know that they have at least 35 centers spread across the 5 major continents. The Aetheria Society is an international community in full operation right now, as you're watching this video. They don't threaten anybody, they're just a little strange. They try to send out spiritual energy to reach the aliens whom they wish to cooperate with out in the universe, whom they refer to as their cosmic masters. Number 6. Love Has Won. Love Has Won began roughly 15 years ago after a woman named Amy Carlson abandoned her family to pursue a life of teaching spiritual ascension to dedicated followers. Depending on who you ask, Amy Carlson is 19 billion years old. Also depending on who you ask, she birthed all of creation and has been reincarnated 534 times. Throughout these reincarnations, she lived briefly as Jesus Christ, Marilyn Monroe, and Cleopatra. You may be thinking to yourself, who in their right mind would believe such audacious claims? The answer is more than you'd expect. The cult didn't really do much. So far as anyone can gather, Amy Carlson was an alcoholic lunatic who demanded that her followers did whatever she said. She's also been accused of abusing the members of her cult, of which about 20 core members lived alongside her in a large house. To be completely honest, the group has done absolutely nothing of note except get kicked out of Hawaii for being crazy. The weirdest thing that happened so far came in 2021 when police in Colorado went to the house of the cult to make a wellness check. They found Amy Carlson dead, wrapped in a sleeping bag, coiled in Christmas lights, and her empty eye sockets filled with glitter. It was pretty nasty, and according to The Independent, 7 arrests were made and some people were charged with the abuse of a corpse. The cult is still around even without Amy, but all they do is upload weird videos on YouTube. Number 5. The Anthill Kids. Roche Thoreau wanted to save himself and his dedicated followers from the incoming apocalypse. He was absolutely convinced that there would be a war between the forces of good and evil, and that it would eventually cause the complete collapse of the world as we know it. As a youngster, he converted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Then one day, he decided to form his own group. He named it the Anthill Kids, apparently because they were going to work hard just like ants. In 1977, the group formed a commune where they had planned to live free from sin and in perfect harmony. If this sounds familiar, that's because it's how every cult starts. But like every other cult, this one quickly spiraled out of control. They were kicked out of the Adventist church for being too weird. Roche Thoreau then forbade his followers from contacting their families. Soon after, he developed a violent drinking problem. Like most belligerent drunks in a seat of power, Roche got mean. He would spy on his followers, hit them with belts and hammers, tie them up, and hang them from the ceiling, and it was even reported that he did things like, well, I can't really repeat that here. By 1979, this guy was completely insane. He forced his commune into the Canadian wilderness, and his reign of terror continued. He gathered himself a group of dedicated women and fathered 26 children. At this point, it had nothing to do with religion. It became a kingdom of violence and abuse, as Roche forced members of his commune to break their own legs with sledgehammers, to eat each other's feces, and all kinds of really sick things. He ripped the teeth and limbs and fingers and toes off his own followers, even torturing them with a blowtorch. He also did horrible, truly unspeakable things to his own children. In the end, after killing multiple people, 2 of his own children, ripping someone's intestines out with his bare hands, using a blowtorch to disfigure someone, amputating a woman's arm with a hunting knife, then smashing in somebody's head with an axe, Roche was finally arrested and given life in prison. He was later murdered by an inmate. Number 4. The Fall River Cult. In 1979, a homeless girl named Doreen Levesque was found dead under the high school bleachers in Fall River, Massachusetts. She was only 17 years old. She was also found bound with fishing wire and her face caved in by a rock. At the time, there was a rumor that the girl's murder had ties to a satanic cult. The rumor was that the poor girl's soul was offered to the devil and that the leader of the terrifying cult was a sadistic pimp by the name of Carl Drew. Then 2 more young girls were killed and their bodies were discovered brutalized beyond recognition. Carl Drew was the main suspect, but the police didn't have much to go on. According to a former detective with the Fall River Police Department, there had been a lot of fear of Carl on the streets around the time. People were scared to speak out against him because he might seek retribution. Eventually, the police did have enough evidence collected, and they arrested Carl Drew and a man named Robin Murphy in connection with the murders, with Drew getting life in prison with no possibility of parole. Drew had apparently been running his small ring of prostitutes like a satanic coven, and was keeping the women he controlled in line by performing nighttime rituals. In the case of the murders, Drew took the whole Satan ritual thing too far, and he's still rotting in jail to this day. Number 3. True Russian Orthodox Church. In 2007, a small group of doomsday cult members belonging to a group they referred to as the True Russian Orthodox Church barricaded themselves in a cave in a snowy forest 400 miles, 644 kilometers from Moscow to sit and wait for the end of the world. Yes, there are crazy cults all over the place, not just in the US. This weird Russian organization was put together by a man named Peter Kuznetsov. He somehow managed to convince 29 people to barricade themselves in the cave with 100 gallons, 380 liters of gasoline, which they threatened to use to blow themselves up if police tried to kick them out. Unsurprisingly, the self-declared prophet Peter was not actually there with them. But what were the beliefs of the cult, and why were they in a cave? They believed that upon death, they would earn a special place in the afterlife where they themselves would be the judges of who went to heaven or hell. The followers were not allowed to watch TV, they couldn't have any money, and they were forbidden from listening to the radio. A few weeks after barricading themselves in the cave, part of it collapsed and 14 members gave themselves up to the police. 5 days later, the leader of the group became manic after he realized his prediction of the world ending was wrong. As of 2016, he was still locked up in the psychiatric ward. Number 2. Order of the Solar Temple. The Order of the Solar Temple is quite unique in that it did not attract the less fortunate or the desperate, as is the case with most of the cults we've talked about today. Instead, the order was composed of elite members of society. It even had a specific membership price which most people would never be able to afford. It was a cult of millionaires, doctors, police, and other high-standing members of society. The order reached its peak in the 1990s and was a weird mixture of evangelical Christianity and Freemasonry. They were hoping to recreate the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society from the 19th century that practiced occult magic. And even though these were the elite members of society, they were still susceptible to crazy ideas. They too thought that an apocalypse was nigh. In fact, they still do, because the order is still around today. The Order of the Solar Temple is most famous for what happened in 1994. Tony Dutoit's infant son was taken by the leaders of the group to their headquarters and stabbed to death with a wooden stake after the leader of the cult, Monroe, decreed the baby the Antichrist. Shortly after, 2 mass murders took place in 2 small villages in Switzerland, with Monroe and 12 of his followers performing a ritual Last Supper. 15 members drank poison and died, 30 were shot in the head or smothered, and 8 more died under strange and suspicious circumstances. Number 1. The Mickey Mouse Club. The first meeting of the Mickey Mouse Club was December 21, 1929. This wasn't a scary murder cult, it was simply a club created by Walt Disney himself to help kids, though it did have a cult-like status. What did the club do for its members? They offered to train young talent for TV and theater. In reality, Disney was forming an army of child stars to grab America's attention while paying them mere pennies. The kids that became part of the Mickey Mouse Club were usually given a contract with a base payment per week, and the option for Disney to drop them at any time and for any reason. The result was that Disney had an abundance of child stars being trained for performances at Disneyland, promotional events, children's hospitals, and everything else under the sun. It was a dog-eat-dog world where the kids struggled to be the best while making very little money and often being kicked out of the club for no reason. Thanks for watching. What do you think of these strange cults? Would you dare join any? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more insane videos just like this one right here on American Eye.